Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all very much indeed for joining us here in Porthkerry Church. Today's talk is part of the Diocese Churches Unlocked Festival. We've been a little bit caught out by our own popularity, which is wonderful. We love that. So it's a little bit of a squeeze, but if we can all make ourselves as comfortable as we possibly can, and I'll try not to make this talk rubbish. So, the purpose of today's talk is to tell you something about the surroundings that we find ourselves in here today. So we're going to be talking a little bit about this fabulous building. I'm also going to be giving away some stuff about what was here before this building was here. I'm going to be talking about some of the people who are remembered out in the churchyard. And all in all, we're looking at the best part of 900 years of history. When I first wrote the preamble to this talk, it said 700, and I'm delighted to have found more, ladies and gentlemen. It goes back a little bit further than I originally knew that it might do. So I'm going to be revealing some exciting stuff. I'm going to be revealing to you the mysterious skeleton that was found underneath this archway clutching a chalice. We're talking about who on earth that might have been. We're going to be talking about names you might have heard of some famous people like Sir Samuel Romilly, like John Wesley, all of which played a part in the history of this place. And we're going to be joining the dots together with as much contemporary stuff as we possibly can. I've got the war diaries of a farmer from Roos. I've got some new snippets of information that I've not come across before until quite recently, and I'll be thanking various people here today for digging them up for me. So let's not muck about. Let's get straight into this, and let's talk about what our agenda is. So, is this switched on? Tends to help if it is. Yes. There we go. So there we go. So this is the structure we're going to follow. So we're going to have a brief history of the church and the restoration, because a lot of what you can see of the church today dates from a restoration done by the Romilly family. We're going to talk about the tower, the bells, and the Lewis family. We're going to talk about the Healers Memorial. Now, I'm going to be pointing at things that might be behind you. Don't panic about it, because you'll be able to see them up here at the same time. And we're also going to talk about the Marian cult, this heretical cult that had its talons dug into this church for, well, I initially thought about 200 years. It looks more like 400 years. But anyway, I'll let you be the judge of that. I'll show you the evidence. You can decide for yourselves. We'll talk about the cross. And thank you to Helen for digging up some stuff about the cross that I'd never come across before. We're going to find out what it looked like, what was on it, why it got defaced, why it's half the size it used to be. There's quite a lot to see about that. And, of course, its connection with the Wesleys. We'll talk about the Joneses at Fonmon with their connection with the Wesleys. I am a little bit obsessed with the Joneses at Fonmon, I don't mind admitting. So it's an excuse to talk about them. We'll talk about the Great War and the tenants. There's a lot to get through, isn't there? So better get cracking, really, isn't I? Let's get going. So let's talk about the very earliest signs of life where we are. So where we are at this precise moment in time is where that number 1 is. And you're probably aware that just on the other side of the clump of trees, there is the remains of an Iron Age hill fort with the bulwarks. And there are other settlements from that period in the area. In Pound Field, there was a roundhouse, the evidence that there had been a roundhouse built there. So when you consider how small the population of Britain was at that point, there's quite an awful lot of activity going on right here. And we believe it's because this place was particularly fertile. There was, I mean, for a long period of history, the Vale of Glamorgan generally was known as the Garden of Wales, but we believe that this part of the world in particular was particularly fertile, and hence the amount of people who were living here. Generally speaking, when the early Christians came here, they tended to want to establish their missions in places that were already of some spiritual significance. So there is some evidence, not a lot, it's a little bit anecdotal, but there is some evidence that this place was. For example, we've got some really pretty ancient yew trees in clumps no more than 100 yards or so away from here. And the significance of that was that pagan rituals worship used to take place usually within enclosures which were surrounded by yew trees, so it was quite common. And given that there has probably been something on this site for such a long period of time, and I'll show you why I believe that in a moment, there's every likelihood that there was something of some significance here long before Christianity, particularly when you get given the pockets of population that we had here as well. So that brings us on to early history, and I'd like to delve straight away into the worlds of legend. So we have quite a nice legend about the very earliest days of Porthkerry. So it is believed that Ceri ap Caed, king of the Elleswig, lived in the neighbourhood before the Christian era. He was interested in all things connected with the sea. We are informed that in this district there was a seaport named Port Kerry. Okay, so we begin to see where that goes. The bard of Kerry, Corfaenor, is said to have been the first to make a ship with a sail and a helm from the race of the Cymrig. Tradition handed on to us that the story is that he was a distinguished naval commander, because he was seldom referred to without the words "the extensive navy" being added to his name. He must often have used his harbour, which was in his domain. Here his fleet could find shelter and protection under the high cliffs. Some authorities believe that Ceri was a nephew or grandson of Caractacus, or Caradog, the Welsh version, and that he assumed the head of the government of South Wales when his uncle was captured and taken prisoner to Rome. He was undoubtedly a wise man and possessed great ability. He constructed many ships at the expense of his country and his lords, for he had numerous fleets at sea. Ceri raised Porthkerry to a position of importance and distinction, and consequently it was named Port Kerry. So what we're gathering there is in the period immediately after the Roman occupation here, the area behind us, if I go back to the little aerial view, the area behind us, which is now the park, that was a port, hence the name. And it's not that big a stretch of the imagination when you consider the number of streams you've got converging down there. I know, obviously, it's all completely devoid of sea now, but there's two factors why that would be. First of all, sea levels are a lot higher back then than they are now due to the Romans using Range Rovers. No, that's not the reason, but for some reason the sea levels are definitely a lot higher back then. And also, we know that in the 17th century, what was referred to as the Great Flood, there was, we believe, possibly a tsunami that swept right the way up the channel. And you can see at beaches like Porthkerry, the Knapp, Southern Down, a bank of silver pebbles that are, geologically speaking, they're completely different from anything around them. The cliffs are all golden coloured, so they're clearly not from here. They were dragged up, we believe, from somewhere out of the Atlantic Ocean and then deposited onto the beaches to create a wall, and those walls have ever since kept the sea out. So that's another part of the reason why there's not a lot of evidence left of a port at Port Kerry. Interestingly, though, one of the things that we do find when we start looking through the records of the name is a reference that I've not come across before. We've always known the incumbents record of this place and how far back that goes. I found a reference in the Book of Llandaff, which just by a few years predates the Norman conquest of Morgannwg, which refers to a priest here. So I'll be sharing that with you in a moment now. So let's come on to the building that we have right here, right now, and the sort of origins of that. So we know a fair amount about that. Let me get to, not going to deliver a sermon, just where my notes are. So the area that we're sort of in here is the earliest bit. We know that we've got three main phases of building. That this area here, the main area, is 13th century, with the tower being added on in the 15th century, and then a big phase of rebuilding with the adding on of the vestry, that coming along in 1867. So those are the sort of phases of building that we've got here. We've also got, why is this clicker not clicking? There we go. A few little things that were here that have subsequently disappeared. So, for example, we can see on the sketch that's on this little pamphlet that there are copies of at the back that you're more than welcome to grab, where there have been things that have disappeared. So we've lost a holy water stoup that was on the back of the church at one time. There's still a little scar you can see on the far right-hand corner of where it once was, and in the middle you can see what it would have looked like. There's a lot of evidence that round about the time of the Reformation, we'll talk a bit about that later, that there were some pretty enthusiastic Puritans who went around destroying stuff that was a little bit too Catholic. So the holy water stoups had it. We also, and you'll hear more about this in a moment, we also had quite an ornate cross out in the yard with images of the Virgin Mary all over it. That got defaced as well. So there was probably a fair amount of vitriol going on in Porthkerry at that time. So these are the main bullet points to the early days. So as I said, this area here, 13th century, incumbents back to 1371. Book of Llandaff tells us that in 1071 there was a priest called Thomas Michael, priest of Port Cerrig. So that I've never seen before now. That's quite new to me. But that goes way back before anything that we can see around us now. So it goes back to what I was saying earlier, that there's some good evidence to support that long before this church was here, there was another church on this site before that, and probably something else before that again. But that's the earliest datable reference I can find to this place existing, which is quite cool, really. You heard it here first, folks. There we are. There's an exclusive. Now, the renovations in 1867 threw up all sorts of things. So I'll read some notes from the restoration, because what that does, it tells us a little bit about what was here before the restoration, what the church was like. It also tells us about some quite interesting finds. And I'm going to refer to two different sources for this. That is lifted from an article that was written in the 19th century in something called the Acolis Cambrensis, which was published in 1876. And what they're talking about here is the building that they were working on, and the restorations that needed to be made. So the present building was repaired and re-roofed in the year 1867. The wall between the nave and the chancel, which is where I am now, was found to be in such dangerous condition that the whole thing had to be rebuilt. So everything that we're looking at here is 19th century. The old chapel arch was of Tudor shape, without moulding of any kind, and in pulling it down, a pewter chalice associated with a skeleton was discovered buried underneath the floor. So, approximately where these flowers are, when this area was being dug up to allow access to put foundations and to put in this arch, the discovery was a skeleton around a chalice. Now, let's put that into some context with when this place was built. Not just anyone was allowed to be buried under a church floor. It was quite, you had to be quite important person. So you would find kings and queens, high-ranking nobility, that sort of thing. They were allowed to be buried under floors. Saints were allowed to be buried under floors, and so were high-ranking clerics. Now, I can't find any records of a saint being buried here, because I know a lot of those records did get destroyed after the monasteries got dissolved. So it's probably not a saint. The chances are, if it had a chalice with it, it was probably some kind of high-ranking priest, somebody who'd made their mark, and I would love to find out who it is. So I only started digging into this in the last fortnight, but I will keep digging, and I will publish what I find. But there was definitely somebody of some interest down there, and because what was built on top of him was 13th century, we just know it was before that. All we know is that's sort of the end mark, but we don't know exactly when he was put down. The article goes on to say that the chalice itself was then taken to Porthkerry House. So it'd be interesting to know if it's still there. You never know. Sometimes these things do just sort of survive with people not really knowing where they are. But the chalice associated with the skeleton ended up across in the house down in the dale below us there. So I thought that was quite cool. It also draws reference to the fact that this church was thatched. until this restoration was done. So if you'd come to see this church before that big restoration in 1867, you'd have seen a thatched church. And I've got a little bit more on that, I believe, No, I'll come back to that because I've just remembered where it is. Yes, so yeah, a thatched church. It's quite quaint, isn't it? We like that. Right, okay. The other thing to talk about that is, of course, the people who paid for the restoration, the people who were behind it, and that's the Romilly family. Now, the Romillys were French Huguenots who, to escape persecution, settled in London. They ran a jewellery shop. They were a successful family business. And Sir Samuel, well, the chap who ended up being Sir Samuel Romilly was a bit of a child prodigy. He never received a formal education, but he was taken under the wing of his local priest, who saw to it that he learned about the scriptures and so on, and it was discovered that he had a bit of an aptitude for the law. So he studied law. He ended up studying law to a point where he became a lawyer, and then he entered politics. He was a radical. So in his early life, he was a big, very, very enthusiastic about the French Revolution, partly because the revolution resulted in there being much more religious tolerance in France, and they never lost their French roots. Apparently the family spoke French to each other in their own home. And he went to France and he met some of the people who were at the heart of making France into a republic. And he was initially very keen on bringing that back to this country. But the closer he got to it, the more he could see the holes in it. And as the years went by, his enthusiasm did temper. But he was always a bit of a liberal radical. And he was very, very big campaigner alongside Wilberforce to end slavery. He ended up making some huge reforms as part of his political career to the criminal justice system and to the access of ordinary people to the law. So he's quite a remarkable man. And in his capacity as Chamberlain, as a politician, and as a lawyer, he amassed a fair amount of wealth. And it was only seen as fitting that he should have a country retreat, a country residence. That's how they ended up in Porthcurry. So they are the people who had the house built in Porthcurry. And the other houses, like, for example, the one that was Egerton Gray and so on, these were the houses that were built for further members of the family as time went on. So the chap who was mainly responsible for the work that was done here wasn't Sir Samuel, who will be delighted they named Wetherspoons after him. But it was his third son who was buried outside. So here's some details about the work that they undertook. And this is where you can see the reference to this. So this screen was part of the original church. So this is pre-Reformation, this screen. It was one of the things that they were able to salvage. So as much as everything else was falling down, this survived. And you can see the description that they've got up there, that the bottom panels in linen fold carving, which is very, very unusual. So this is quite a special piece, and it's amazing that they were able to save it. And they also added on the vestry, and they dressed this arch in brick. But just outside the church door, if you look directly towards the woods, that's where you can see the tomb of the Baron. And if you think back to the title of this talk, the word Baron definitely crops up. So there we are, Baron Edward Romilly. He also went into politics. He was MP for Ludlow. He was also a bit of a progressive, but he was also a first-class cricketer. And he played for Marylebone Cricket Club and represented them at a first-class level. So there we are. We can see he attended Trinity College 1822, played cricket for Marylebone 1825 to 31. Whig, sorry. So in the olden days, it was the Whigs and the Tories, as opposed to, well, the Whigs became the Liberal, what's now the Liberal Democrat Party. And he was chairman of the Board of Audit, 1855 to 1865. So he did all right for himself as a third son. Third sons generally didn't prosper as much as others in this period, but he did awfully well. And he's got that rather grand mausoleum out there. So there we go. That's the Baron Edward Romilly. Tower and the bells. Now, this, as I mentioned before, the tower was added on at a later date in the 15th century. The bells that are inside, very unusual for a church this small to have 6 bells. But we have 6 bells. They're all still there. They all still work. In fact, they were being rung quite often this week, thanks, Kim. So we've got here a little bit of information about the bells. Now, I mentioned about the Egerton Grey, which was built as a rectory, really, for one of the Romneys when he was the vicar here. The Lewis family lived there for some time, and they were very enthusiastic about making sure that the church had a proper set of bells. So they saw to it, and you can see here some background on all the different bells, so where they were made. So, for example, we've got the earliest bell, built by Henry Jeffreys of Bristol around 1550. This bell was repaired by tailors of Loughborough in 1998 using the modern bell welding technique. I'm sure, Helen, you know exactly what that is. Not a clue. Not my area. Paid for by Gethin Lewis. And you can see there where each of the bells came from, when it was hewn, and the work that they did to get the tower to the stage that it's at now is commemorated by a plaque that we've got there hanging at the back. And the Lewis family are still around. They were living in Pentline Castle until quite recently, so they're still active. And there we are. We've got that memory to the work that was done by them to get those bells into the state that they're in today. So fantastic. We have a debt owed to them indeed. And they have a tomb outside. It's not quite as grand as it was when this picture was taken. So as you can see, that's the tower when it was coated in ivy. And this area down here, bottom left, with the very low hedges around it, that's the tomb. That's what the tomb is. There's not a lot of that hedge left, but there are little traces of it if you want to have a little look when you pop out. So, yeah, that was the tomb dedicated to the Lewis family. And while we're talking about tombs, we've got a few quite significant memorials dotted around the church and in the churchyard. I'm not going to talk about them all, but there's a few that I'm going to pick on. This is quite an important one. So that's just over there. And whenever you read records of this church that have been written by people who have visited, they always draw attention to this because it's quite unique. And it's a great example. So the inscription says, "Here lies the body of Reynold Poetry, Esquire, deceased on the 24th day of February," which is my birthday, incidentally. Just thought I'd throw that out there. But you knew that. In 1629, having lived 63 years. It's also worth pointing out that the spelling is atrocious. So the chap who carved it was an excellent stonemason. The craft is superb. But yeah, the spelling is all over the place. So yeah, lived his life, cured many of several infirmities without reward. Now that has really got me curious. So was he a physician? What was he doing? How did he cure people? So he must have been something of a healer. And he left living his loving wife, who caused this monument of her affection, of so loving a husband, to be set up, and desires to be also interred when she dieth. She leaves one son, Alexander, and 2 daughters. And when the son and daughter died, somebody thought, let's get them added to the tomb. And the standard is nothing like as good. So you've sort of got this rather wonderful inscription, which is at the center of it all. And then you've got these amateur bits where somebody's just bashed in a little bit extra when the children died, unfortunately. It hasn't kept it in its best as a result of that. But there is something else interesting about this tomb, and it links me to one of the most fascinating parts of this church's history. And you can see in the top left, there we go. Oh, there's the inscription. Yeah, I forgot I had that slide. So, yeah, there's the tomb again. So you can see in the top left that little symbol there. So let me bring that up so you can see that a bit clearer. That is a rose. And the rose is there to tell people who are in the know that there are heretics in this church who want their presence to be known for the benefit of fellow heretics. And by our standards today, it may not seem like, that big a deal, but at the time, it was quite a significant threat they faced if they were ever uncovered. So let me give you a bit of a flavour of what that's all about. So this movement came into being after the Reformation. And one of the things, there were many things about the Reformation that people weren't altogether sure about, but one of the things that really irritated a certain bunch of people was the downgrading of the Virgin Mary as a figure of central worship. Because in the Catholic faith, she is absolutely front of house, upstage there. But in the Book of Common Prayer, she's mentioned 7 times from cover to cover. And that was just too much for a bunch of people who just really had trouble with it. So what they would do was they would meet in secret, have their own masses where they could have the Virgin Mary back in. Now, that's a very dangerous thing to do. And you had to be sure that when you were doing this sort of thing, you had people on your side who were looking out for you. So that was one of the things, one of the marks that people would put for fellow worshippers to go, oh, there is clearly a bunch of people, if this is part of my belief system, there's a bunch of people here who have got something in common with me. Now, you do see these little marks all over the place. They are usually very, very subtle. They are usually carved into little roof beams in top corners where people don't really see them, and you have to look out for them. So for that to be so blatant, right front, as soon as you walk through the church, first thing you see, they were pretty brazen, the ones who are doing it here. And we can't be sure if it's portrait, i.e. the person who's been remembered on the tomb, who that rose is for, or if it was the stonemason who created it. Because we know that the Marian cult, as it was known, we know that most of the people who belonged to it were craftspeople. They were carpenters and stonemasons and joiners and that sort of thing. So it's not clear which is which. Now, that is not the only cult mark that we have in this church. But before I move on to the others, let me give you the significance of that. I'm not going to read all of that out. But the rose has been a symbol of the Catholic faith and of the Virgin Mary for as far back as it goes. You have rosary beads, for example. So the rose has always been very strongly associated. We've got other symbols. So, for example, this is a grave which is out in the churchyard, which is absolutely littered with cult marks. Again, giving away that that's not the only example that we have. We've got those out there. But the ones that you see most commonly, and probably haven't even noticed, are on the door. So we've got this medieval door, wonderful chunky bit of old oak. But as you can see, it is peppered with cult marks. So the last one that I showed you was the rose. This cult mark here, it looks like a W. It's got 2 meanings. So it's either an inverted M for Mary, so tipped upside down so it looks like a W, or it is 2 interlocking V's, as in Virgin of Virgins. So it's a mark, and there's not just one, there's 4 cult marks carved into that door at different points in history. So this cult were pretty brazen here. They were fairly confident that they weren't going to get into trouble for doing this. And in a minute, I'll show you a timeline which gives you an idea how long this went on here. I've got a little definition there, which I won't read all of it, but you can see on the right-hand side all of the different derivations of those marks. And apparently, I haven't been to check this out, but I'm reliably informed that in Penmark, one of the pews has got, because ours have just been crudely just rammed into the door. In Penmark, there's a really beautifully carved one. So it wasn't just this church where it was going on. There were obviously clearly fragments of it going on all over the place. But there we go, Marian cult. Now, let me give you this timeline, because this is what surprises me. Here's the timeline that we've got here. So obviously you had the Act of Supremacy passed in 1534. So let's take that as ground zero. We've got the first tomb that I showed you a moment ago, ding, which is dated, the earliest date on that is 1629. We've got the door, which is dated 1790. And then we've got the tomb outside of Ernest Thomas, dated 1893. So For 400 years, people coming to this church and observing, the Protestant faith were in the background having their own little version of it that sort of ran alongside in their own little way. So that's an awful long time for that to have survived. We can't say for certain that it was unbroken, and there's good evidence to support that the 1893 one was a bit of an isolated one, but nonetheless, it still survived for an awfully long time. And the 1893 one, Ernest Thomas, there was, in the latter part of the 19th century, a thing called the Oxford Movement, and we know that Ernest Thomas went to Oxford, so the chances are he is part of this, but there were some thinkers at the time who wanted to see more sort of Catholic-style religious processes and so on reintroduced back into the church as it was, the Protestant church. So he might be an isolated incident, but there we go. But yeah, quite an interesting little thing, little bit of... we get the impression that people who came to this church always had a little bit of a problem with authority. So we've got the Marian cult going on. We've also got a lot of evidence to support the idea that pretty well everyone who worshipped here, when they weren't worshipping here, were helping Thomas Knight smuggle stolen goods and stuff that had been pirated off ships down at Barry Island. So we think the people who worship here have got their own little ideas about how things should be run. Probably hasn't changed much, has it? We've also got this rather wonderful cross outside. Now, even though it's quite a decent size structure, it's actually half the size of what it once was. And I'm going to go back to the 1876 Archeol Cambrensis for some fantastic notes. Gratitude to Helen for digging this up for me. So these people actually published a sketch of what they believed the cross once looked like and gave us this explanation. So some description at the Porthcawl is to be seen. Right, the sculpted portion illustrates on a larger scale was so high above the ground and in so mutilated a condition as to look like a shapeless mass of stone from below. In a heavy gale shortly before Christmas 1874, this piece was blown down and turned out to be a fragment of what must have been a very fine group of sculpture. The heads of all the figures have been knocked off. So you remember me saying earlier about how the spout got knocked down by some overzealous Puritans. I'll carry on reading. You'll see why they took offence at this one. Heads knocked off of all the figures, doubtless by ill-judged zeal of hot-headed Puritans. I love this language. To whom we are indebted so largely for the loss of artistic relics of the past. This is actually true. My wife and I went to Norwich Cathedral a few weeks ago, and there's plenty of examples of statues where they've just taken off the heads but left the statues there to say, well, the heads have gone because we don't approve of this sort of thing, but the reason why we've left the rest of it is as a warning to you not to come back and put more up, because this is what will happen. So quite an interesting little thought process they had going there. So only half the original mass remains, the other part having probably fallen off long ago. So in other words, we believe it was 16 foot high, this cross, at one time. I mean, 8 seems quite a lot, but 16 is massive. The fracture appears to owe its origin to the iron bar passing through the centre. So the sculpture portion of the cross in its present mutilated condition is a block of oolite, 1 foot 6 inches high, but must have been 6 inches higher when perfect. The pedestal supporting the figures is ornamented by 4 shields with a carved leaf between each. The central figure of the group of sculptures is that of the Virgin Mary, sitting on a seat 4.5 inches high. So clearly the people of Porthcawl could not make up their minds about the Virgin Mary. Some people are just knocking her off her pedestal, other people trying to bring her back. Sitting, supporting the Holy Child on her right knee and holding his right hand in her left, the other arm being round the back of the child. The foot of the Virgin appears from beneath the drapery, which falls on each side. So this was a really, really ornate piece of sculpture, which, considering we were a little port on the edge of nowhere at this point in history, is quite remarkable. Total height of the Virgin's figure must have been 1 foot 3 inches. On the Virgin's right is a smaller figure, 10 inches high, and if the group was originally symmetrical, there must have been a similar figure to correspond on the other side. Behind the Virgin's back, there are the remains of a mutilated standing female figure, 10 inches high. And from the appearance of the stone, it would seem that there had probably been a crucifix in the center and another figure beside it. The position of the different figures will be best understood from the sketch plan given. That's that one. 1 sitting figure of Virgin Child, 2 male standing, 3 ditto, 4 female standing, 5 ditto, 6 crucifix. Between the shield and the leaf were ornamental and pedestal, which will be observed through a hole or socket, round the edges of which are the remains of lead, which must have been used to fasten an iron bar of some kind to the object. So, absolutely remarkable. The steps are of lyre stone. The total height of the cross is 16 foot above the ground. So, at some point, it doesn't look very much now, just like a jagged bit of stone. But at some point in history, that would have been quite a remarkable piece of sculpture, and doubtless something that the people of this church were very proud of. Now, this cross has a link with the second person I'm going to talk about that you might have heard of after the Romillys, a chap by the name of John Wesley. Now, John Wesley was the father of the Methodist movement. He preached all over the place, really. He wasn't always well received. They loved him here. They seemed to love him here. But he, as I say, for contrast, because I'm about to tell you about the people who flocked to see him here, but let me just share this one with you. So this is evidence that John Wesley was not always well received. I preached today at Newport on what I must do to be saved, to the most insensible, ill-behaved people I have ever met in Wales. One ancient man cursed and swore almost incessantly, and towards the conclusion took up a great stone and many times attempted to throw it. So they didn't like him in Newport, but they seemed to love him here, and I've got extracts from his diary. Now, we're now treading into an area that I'm quite passionate about. There was a family in Funmon Castle called the Joneses, and one of the most powerful families in the whole of Britain, and very few people outside of this little corner know anything about them. So I can see some people here from the History Society who heard my talk on the Joneses, but there was a lot of religious conflict within this family, and there's a chap called Robert Jones who was, we believe, what's the word I'm looking for? Battle of Culloden, not Jesuit. Jacobite, that's right, thank you very much. So, there is evidence to support the idea that he actually bought a portrait, quote, of James III, unquote. So, that generally, and this family had always been Presbyterian, so that's quite weird in itself. The lady he chose as his wife, Mary, was quite a passionate disciple of John Wesley. And the two brothers, John and Charles Wesley, both would frequently stay in Fonmon. So as that Fonmon is so close, they obviously did a fair amount of preaching in and around the area, specifically here. Now, up until now, I've only ever been aware of 2 visits to this church. But I'm indebted to Rachel for flagging up she believes she once saw a third, and I can conclude, having read his diary, there was a third visit. So on 3 separate occasions he came here. It's quite heavy going, John Wesley. So he when he preached, it would quite often, he would go 2 or 3 times a day to preach to the crowds, and his sermons would last anything up to 3 hours. He made a reference on the 19th of October 1739 that his sermon only lasted 30 minutes, and he wrote in his diary to justify why it was so short. So that gives you an idea of the sort of person we're dealing with here. But these are the references we've got. So we've got Friday the 2nd of October 1741. We rode to Fonmon Castle. We found Mr. Jones's daughter ill of the smallpox, but he could cheerfully leave her and all the rest in the hands of him in whom we now believe. In the evening I preached at Cardiff in the Shire Hall. a large and convenient place, on God hath given unto us eternal life, and his life is in his Son. There have been a feast in the town that day. I believed it useful to add a few words upon intemperance. And while I was saying, as for you drunkards, you have no part in this life. You abide in death. A man cried out, I am one, and thither, and I am going. But I trust God at that hour began to show him and others a more excellent way. After preaching at Porthcurry in the morning, in the evening at Cardiff, I expounded Zechariah. Who art thou, O great mountain? So there we go. So there's a couple of references. Then Monday the 19th, after preaching at Wenvo, Porthcurry, and Fonmon the day before. So he doesn't, I preached once more at Porthcurry. And in the afternoon returned to Cardiff and explained to a large congregation. So by the sound of it, he came twice on Monday the 19th. And then on Sunday, the 2nd of October, fearing my strength would not suffice for preaching more than 4 times in the day, I only spent half an hour in prayer with the society in morning. At 7 in the evening, I preached at the castle. At 11 in Wenvo Church, and in the afternoon at Porthcurry, on repent ye and believe the gospel. So, he had a relationship with Mary Jones that many people question how deep that relationship went, because Robert Jones passed away, and after he passed away, his son, and I love this, his nickname is Wild Robert. So this Wild Robert was being brought up by John Wesley as a sort of surrogate father figure, and John Wesley had a Methodist faith school in Kingswood in Bristol. And when Mary suggested that perhaps they should send Wild Robert to this school, John Wesley said, I fear that the discipline may be too much for him. So if John Wesley thinks the discipline in this school is strict, it is strict. So he suggests as an alternative, and this doesn't sound any better, he should be whipped to Harrow. So again, this poor Robert. Anyway, he ended up hating John Wesley, as you can understand, because he was a bit of a good time boy, was Wild Robert. His dowry was the Sace family estate, which was the castles of Boverton and things like that. So he acquired loads and loads of land, immediately sold it all, and ploughed it into making Fonmon Castle the castle that it is now. So it was a very dark and dingy place. He had all the walls knocked through to put in these large windows you can see now. He was the one who put in that wonderful staircase and hall. He also was responsible for the Rococo ceiling in the library. So he spent an absolute fortune. And of course, his mother, being a follower of John Wesley, thought this was all opulent, over the top, showing off. So the two of them didn't get on. So she moved out of the castle and lived in what was at the time the Dower House. And I've got a picture of the Dower House. Any minute now. There we go. There's a picture of the Dower House. So this is where she lived. This is where she entertained the Wesleys. It might look familiar to you. That's what it looks like now. So the Wesleys, as you know, did preach abstinence and temperance, and the place where they used to stay is now a pub. So what they would make of that, I have no idea. But one thing that's quite interesting, that even though the temperance movement sprung out of the Methodist movement, they didn't all start at the same time. It sort of came a little bit later. So when the Fonty was being turned into a pub, it was still owned by the Fonmon estate. And they had to do some work at the back to build the lavatories at the back. And when they were digging into the ground, they discovered the entry to an old cellar everyone had forgotten was there. And it was full of wine bottles with Mary Jones's crest and initials on. So while she was living here, which is quite a long way into her relationship with the Methodist movement, she was clearly still drinking quite a lot of wine. So make of that what you will. So that's Wesley's, Joneses. There we are. Have I got anything else on there? No, that's it. That's it on them. But it's not the end of our link with the Fonty. Because we're kind of moving into people who are remembered here in different ways. And I bring your attention to this rather wonderful stained glass window depicting St. Kyrrig. So this is in memory of Mary Jane Savers, who the Savers family, is there any relatives here? Because it's a Roos family, there must be some of them still around. No, not today. Okay, so the Savers basically lived in the farms in Roos. So you had one side of the family who lived in Roos Farm, the other side lived in Fontagary Farm. They fell out. There was a big argument. I'm not sure what the argument was about, which is why I'm looking for relatives. So I want to find out the dirt. But there was this big argument where they fell out and they never spoke to each other again. And they even split up in terms of which churches they would worship at. So even though they're all, within a few hundred yards of each other, this branch of the Savers families from Roos Farm came to worship here, and the ones from what was Fontagary Farm used to worship in Penmark, even though the father of the Fontagary one was a church warden here. So he's a church warden here, but never set foot in the place because this is where his brother worshipped. Most bizarre. The other reference to the Savers you can see is right next to that stained glass window, which is the memorial for Arthur William Savers, who died sadly just a couple of months before the end of the First World War. So he'd been over there and had done his bit and just didn't quite make it to the last. Now, his cousin, who lived over in Fontagary, who's this chap here, Edward Walter Savers, he did survive. He did come back from the First World War. He was in the Royal Flying Corps. He was in a few regiments, actually, but Royal Flying Corps is what he's known for. This wonderful man kept a diary for the whole time that he was, well, not just during the First World War, he kept a diary of what the farm was like and how they used to harvest and look after the animals, the names of the horses and things like that. But I'd like to read to you a little section from his diary on arriving in Flanders in 1918. I will try and give some recollection of the 1914-18 war. I shall never forget my first experience of enemy shell fire. I was a second lieutenant in command of an infantry platoon, about 20 NCOs and men, with my battalion, the 24th Denbigh Yeomanry Royal Fusiliers. I had come from Egypt in May 1918. We joined the 31st Division on the front, east of Hartsbrook in Flanders. We were in reserve trenches. Each evening at dusk, we marched up the forest sides or tracks, platoon by platoon, to the front line trenches, then situated immediately in front of Neep Forest. For 2 nights we worked almost undisturbed, erecting barbed wire defences, repairing trenches and placing war stores in position. The German Veery lights lit up the sky, but did not alarm us. There was occasional machine gun fire and rifle fire, showing that the sentries on both sides were alert. We worked quietly and returned to our reserve position when our task was done for breakfast and sleep. On the 3rd evening, we had almost reached the front line when all hell was let loose. The enemy guns opened up in a terrifying bombardment on our positions. Shells exploded around us like thunderclaps. Trees fell with crackling thuds. Dirt and soil whizzed about us. The smell of explosive material reached our nostrils. The din was unbearable and seemed to go on and on for ages. I thought none of us would escape alive. However, when at last the barrage did end, to my surprise, we all stood up, shaken and terrified, but uninjured. The men had needed no orders to fall flat on their faces on the ground when the bombardment commenced. A few casualties reported in an adjoining platoon. After a rest and after making a count of heads, I ordered the men to proceed to their working stations, but we did not easily forget the experience, perhaps because it was our first under shell fire. We were to have more. So those are the words of a farmer from Roos on the front lines, the cousin of that man remembered right there. And there's quite a few connections around us with the First World War. So you may notice, there we go, various plaques and shields and things dotted all over the place. So the one in the centre of this picture is just in the tower where they haven't just listed the people who were lost, they've listed everybody who went, which is quite good, because you generally speaking, it's just those that didn't return. But we've got everybody who went, where they served, and what regiment they were attached to, or which of the services they were attached to. And also, of course, we've got the brass plaques. There's one right there, one to the side of the organ, one on the organ. We've got another one at the top on the lich gate. So lots of memorials. There was clearly a fair amount of money in the village in this period because there was a lot of money spent. There's the Lich Gate that you walk through to get here. That is a memorial to the First World War, as you can see from the engraving right the way across the top, and you've got a brass plaque there as well. Also, the organ itself. And this is a lovely story you may or may not have heard. But when we had, I'm sure I got a picture of the organ as a holding slide. There we go. When we had the organ restored a few years ago, the whole thing had to be taken apart so they could get into the bowels of the thing and do the work that needed to be doing. When they'd stripped it apart, there was a board that ran across the top of the area where the bellows are. Is that right? Yeah, I'm trying to remember exactly what it was. Which had these roundels on it. So, the people who built this organ are from Belfast. It's the only organ built by these people in this area. So, there must have been some reason why it was them they chose. But it's unlikely they'd have come from Belfast with all the materials that they needed to build the thing. So, they'd have sourced some materials locally. So, when we found this, we were a bit perplexed. And we thought, well, maybe it's something to do with, maybe there was an airfield where the airport is now. Well, there wasn't. Because at the end of the First World War, the nearest airstrip was Ely, the racecourse in Ely. There's nothing here. That didn't come until after the Second World War. So we thought, well, what is it then? Where is it likely to have come from? The truth is we have never really solved this riddle. We had people writing to us from all over the country with ideas and theories as to where this came from. The best we can come up with is anything, whether it's a crate or a chest, but anything that was meant to have been dispatched to the forces would have had an emblem on it to tell whoever's delivering who it belonged to. So the best we can come up with is that this thick piece of wood was at some time, because that's the other thing, airplanes were they weren't made out of wood even back then, they were canvas stretched over wood, so it's not even likely to be the panel from an airplane or the wing of an airplane. So the best guess is it was some kind of a crate that had parts in it that were meant to be dispatched to the Royal Flying Corps. That's the best we can come up with. But we'll welcome any other theories because we're still not altogether sure. It's not just the Allied side who are remembered in the graveyard. We also have a grave for this chap who some of you might know because it wasn't that long ago he died, lived in Rous. He was a pilot for Cambrian Air. There we are. Bit of a character from what I can gather. So I've got some notes now because I only got these, and thank you Hugh ever so much for finding them for me. I've got some notes I'll pass around for you to have a look at. Hugh posted a picture of this man's grave on social media and got loads of responses from people who knew him and knew things about him, and so I'll pass it around for you to have a good look at. But this man is, as you can see on the left-hand side, when he passed away, he had an obituary in the New Scientist. And the reason why he had an obituary in the New Scientist is because he was an inventor. And the invention that he's most known for, and you'll see in the notes, he did other things. Apparently, he managed to create a radio the size of which could fit into a matchbox. So he was a very clever man. He did all sorts of little things. But the thing that he's best known for is a submarine made out of concrete. Now, you may think that sounds like a lead balloon, but apparently, everyone says, people who know about these sort of things say, well, actually, that's not a dull idea. And it wasn't just made of concrete, ladies and gentlemen. It also had panels that would be filled with water. So it does sound like a disaster, and I don't know much about this sort of thing, but apparently the benefits of it are that it would be able to dive deeper than anything else, have a much longer range than anything else, and he claimed that the German Navy had made a prototype of it, but there's never been any evidence to back that claim up. But nonetheless, pretty interesting guy, and I'll hand those notes around so you can have a little look. There is another grave I'll draw your attention to, and this one I love because it just shows the philanthropy of the people of Porthkerry. So down by the woods in the bottom part of the yard out there, you'll see this grave which just says a seafaring man found drowned 1866. So a constant reminder of the perils of the sea, and we're kind of going full circle from saying, well, the very earliest history we have of this place is a port that was the dominion of this Welsh king's navy. But the sea has always played an important part to us here. And we think the earliest church that was here was for people to pray at before, because we're not that far from places like Llancarvan, where missionaries would have gone to Brittany and places like that. So every likelihood that have come here to pray before descending down to the port. But apparently this is quite common. If you go through the church records of any of the churches on the Glamorgan coast, you will find listings of people who were found on the beach and who no one recognized, no one knew who they were, so the congregation would have a whip around and pay for a funeral. But obviously they wouldn't go to a great expense because nobody knew who this person was. So they would generally just mark the grave with a wooden cross, which over time disappeared. So the only evidence that this ever happened is generally in the church records. There's nothing visible for you to see. But here, they put a stone grave, which is why it's lasted. So we are quite unusual in that we've got something you can point at and say, well, here's evidence that this happened here. And the thing that I love about this best, nothing to do with history, it just reaffirms my faith in human nature. There are people who tend this. And every time I go down to it, I quite often see fresh flowers. And nobody knows who this man is, so it's not a family descendant. It's just somebody who, out of the good faith of their heart, wants this person or all the people that this person represents to be remembered. So I think that's rather wonderful. And it kind of brings me to the close of my talk, really. I will take some questions at the end, but hopefully you've got a fairly rounded understanding now of this church, of why it's here, of how long it's been here, and how much longer, as it turns out, than we thought, of who on earth the mysterious skeleton clutching the chalice was under our arch, of our 16-foot cross, who paid for that to be engraved like it was remarkable, and then defaced and then destroyed by a storm, and now just a little mystic spike. And the people that we'll remember with the tombs dotted around, whether it's a healer, whether it's a drowned man, whether it's a baron. There is plenty of remarkable history all around us. And I'd like to thank you all very much indeed for giving me your attention. Thank you. Thank you very much.